our theme for this session, I think, is an interesting one. We chose the theme for this webinar as connectedness. And today we want to really explore that from a business perspective. And I want to frame the discussion by saying, yes, we're going to be talking about diversity and equity and inclusion, and to some sense belonging in organizations that can perhaps build connectedness in teams. But the frame for our discussion is really how to use these as tools to harness human potential and to bring every mind together to help us to actually work on the challenges and solutions in organizations. And I am very grateful to be joined this morning by two really wonderful people who work in the field and who are experts. So first of all, we have Ricky Manuki with us. Ricky, thank you so much for your time today. Ricky is a co-founder of Womanico, and one of the tools that Womanico use is they facilitate DE&I workshops with a lot of different clients across South Africa. So it's lovely to have you with us, Ricky, and we look forward to your insights and sharing, I'm sure, some very interesting stories and lessons and the best to do. And then also very, very grateful that we are also joined by Melissa Bosch. So you will hear Melissa is very much a South African. She remains a South African at heart, but she is now located in Ireland. She's the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion with a large professional services firm, and can share, I think, some firsthand stories with a South African perspective, but with an international lens of what we need to be focusing. So, ladies, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and we look forward to having you discuss all these things, and probably a really good time in light of the fact that there's been a lot, I think, of negativity almost in the press in the last probably 2 to 3 weeks around DE&I and the slants that are taken and things like that. So it's probably a good time to put a spotlight on it and a good time to have an open discussion around, I think like most things, DE&I can be done well and it can be done badly and it can be done with the wrong intention. But I'm really looking forward to our conversation this morning and getting some perspective and just reminding ourselves that we can also always keep an open mind and learn something. So you are most welcome, and a very warm welcome to all our listeners that have dialed in with us this morning. And thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to kick off. We've got a few questions we thought of together that would be useful to frame the discussion. And then we're going to see if there are any questions in the chat at the end, and we'll see how we go. So Ricky and Melissa, lovely to have you with us. So maybe kicking off, and Ricky, I'm going to ask you to perhaps start and then Melissa to come to you, is, I think there's many definitions of DE&I out there, and maybe we all have our own. So it might be good to get some common ground. So if you think of, for you personally, what is that definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Ricky?
Good morning, Carrie, and good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be having this conversation. I think it's timely in terms of what's happening in our world and what's happening in our community. So if I were to try and define diversity, inclusion, and equity, I think diversity is primarily about recognizing that there are many things that make us different, and these differences impact on how we are able to show up and work. I think what's been missing in our understanding of diversity is how intersectional diversity can be. Feminist concept, but the idea that I'm not just a Black person, I'm a Black woman, and that combination in and of itself has different impacts. When I think about inclusion, I learned this from a friend of mine, Roy Glassman. Inclusion is a feeling. It is the feeling of being comfortable. It's the feeling that I can participate with the best of me in the work that I do. And when I think about equity, equity is I guess equity, I would say, is the systems that we put in place to ensure that what holds us back in terms of diversity allows us to move towards inclusion.
I love that, Ricky. Thank you so much. And Melissa, perhaps to come across to you, I know this is a real passion of yours. So Absolutely. What does it mean to you?
Absolutely, it's a complete passion for me, and really, it's seeded in for me personally. It's seeded in the philosophy of Ubuntu, and being able to see ourselves in each other. So it's everything that Ricky spoke about. Um, but it's also about creating those environments where people feel valued, they feel heard, that they have access to equal opportunities. But we see the barriers that have been put in place for them. So it's about breaking down those barriers. It's about challenging those biases in the workplace in a way that truly not only celebrates diversity, but harnesses the power and the impact of inclusion and creates that
Mm.
sense of belonging. And that cuts across various characteristics. And like Ricky said, it is so intersectional. It layers upon each other. And I'm not one dimension. I'm not just race. I'm not just gender. I'm not just age. I'm all of these things. And these things aren't handicaps, but once you harness them, they can unlock the power and potential in the individual, but also for the organization. And for me, it's really about broader society as well.
Mm.
Workplaces are microcosms of broader society. So, what a great place to start having those conversations around equity and inclusion. So yeah, that's my view on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And thank you so much. I think it is so important today, right? Because we are working in organizations, increasingly multinationals, many different people, different cultures, races, religions, all of those things. And it is really important to really think about belonging and really think about how do we actually embrace people, I guess, for their humanness almost, and actually just remind ourselves of the importance. And it's also, I think, for me, diversity is also about really getting each mind to really, come to the table and share their thinking. Because when we have, for example, diversity in thinking, we can also have really great ideas around the table, which can actually move our organizations forward. And not everyone thinks the same because we have so many factors that influence who we are. But Melissa, maybe to come to you, having, I think, this unique perspective growing up in South Africa with all the things that make us us, you've moved across the world and experienced a completely, I think, different culture. But I think more importantly, belonging and inclusiveness are even more important when you move internationally. And I think are increasingly important for businesses today as they start hiring talent from around the world. So, why do you think it's really important for businesses to focus on belonging and inclusion as they broaden their reach and sphere of influence?
So, like, I can absolutely give you the playbook around the business case for diversity and equity and inclusion. It fosters innovation, it drives creativity and problem solving. But you nailed it there. In today's globalized world, uh, businesses have to, it's imperative that they do recognize and harness the value of that diversity if they want to remain relevant. Um,
Mm.
there's such a commercial edge to this, and sometimes when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we think about it in the sense of it's the right thing to do, which of course it is the right thing to do, but the
Mm.
motivation for businesses is to actually make sure that they get the best results for their clients in a sustainable way. We like it. Diversity, equity, inclusion, it drives innovation. It brings together a multitude of perspectives, a multitude of ideas and experiences, and it can significantly enhance employee engagement, productivity, and loyalty. So does it come without a warning label? Of course not. With any kind of diversity, there's conflict. So it's all about navigating that conflict. And
Mm.
where I've seen DE and I mature is that we're moving from the space, and we're trying really desperately to move from the space of celebrating our differences, the diversity, and looking at it through a lens of equity and inclusion. So looking at it through in a way that, okay, so we have all this diversity. What are we going to do with it? How do we actually harness the potential of it? And it's not going to be sitting around a fire holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's going to be, how do we find ways to be more culturally competent? When I use culturally competent, I'm using it broadly, not just for ethnicity. I'm using it across various characteristics where people come together around and group around those characteristics. But how do we harness that to get better results? How do we make sure people truly feel that sense of belonging? This is becoming imperative. It's becoming imperative because things are moving at such a rapid pace. Businesses are evolving so rapidly that they need to keep pace with the diversity that's coming into organizations. In Ireland, we're at full employment. So that means that we're getting a lot of internationals coming to Ireland and working in various industries. With that comes a lot of challenge because the Ireland is pretty young when it comes to diversity. It's I mean I've been living here for 13 years, and I've seen how much Ireland has changed in terms of just purely ethnic diversity. The food has changed. The people that you see on the street has changed, and with that comes conflict in terms of, okay, how do we work together culturally? So to answer your question, it really imperative that businesses think about how move from that area of celebrating diversity to actually actively and intentionally looking at equity and inclusion practices that make a difference for their population.
Thanks, Melissa. And I think I would reflect on that and say it's very true, right? And it's probably true, Ricky. I'm sure you've seen some issues around this even in South Africa. So maybe looking at the trends for South African business, what do you see as important around that belonging and inclusiveness lens? And what have you seen perhaps people dealing with or struggling with as they've grappled with this, as also their business changes and goes through different sort of waves of change?
Thanks, Carrie. So before I dive into some of the trends, I think I was listening to Melissa and I was thinking about belonging. And I love that belonging has entered our lexicon because I think belonging takes us closer to the feeling of inclusion. But I think that businesses do not recognize what then belonging demands, because belonging is your feeling. How do you measure if someone belongs? How do you can put in a lot of external input, but that doesn't mean that you can help someone belong. And so I think belonging is really pushing the boundaries, and it's helping us to look at some really key and important issues in the South African context, and I think in the global context. Number one is issues around mental health, well-being. So kind of the boundary between society and business is being weakened. Because if you want people to belong, you have to recognize that they are not singular beings just at work, that are not impacted by what's happening in the rest of their lives. So I think when we begin to think about belonging, it's an opportunity, but it's also really scary for business. And they have tried to operationalize it in business sense instead of operationalizing it in a human sense. And this is kind of where we hit the pothole when we're doing diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging work. We want to operationalize it and say, okay, everyone's done their training, so everything's solved, but we're not really recognizing what are the challenges that we as human beings face. So I've seen a lot of unconscious bias training happening over the past years, but then you find you're going back to the same company to do the same unconscious bias And the very soft tell you we've done this like 5 times already, but it's not showing up in practice and culture and how we relate, right? And it's because unconscious bias is not about the definition of unconscious bias. It's about how do I learn the internal skills that help me to recognize my own unconscious bias. How do I learn to relate differently? How do I learn to resolve conflict, like Melissa said? How do I learn to overcome what are deep historical divisions? And South Africa is a place where those historical divisions have very particular meaning. So again, we've had this kind of equity in South Africa is really about representation. We haven't gotten to the place where we look at the systems of how people exist and experience life. We're still fighting about representation and getting the numbers right for the races, for the gender, and really not able to get to how people relate with each other. So those are some of the trends. Some of the other trends I've seen is especially this year, there's been a growing recognition of generations and the issues that different generations are facing. So we had a big drive around youth unemployment, and there's been more young people coming into the workplaces. But because it's intersectional, that also is more problems. And it's not just problems about how we understand ourselves as generations. It's also problems about vulnerability. So we've heard a lot more about sexual harassment with more young women coming into the workplace. Because in society, we know a lot more about gender-based violence, but we haven't impacted how people know how to relate and change in relation to that. On the other spectrum, we've got a growing recognition of the impact for older generations. So menopause issues for women. And a really interesting thing that I've now experienced more and more in the workplace is the violence issues for men. So talking to white men who were of age in the 1980s and the impact of being in war on them, and the fact that there isn't enough place or space to talk about that because we like to prioritize. You know, as I said, as we operationalize, we prioritize, we say, no, we're going to focus on this and this and this, and we don't create enough space for the real lived experiences. But then that cohort is our senior and is our management cohort. So how does that impact how they lead? And how do we give them room to process and reckon with these experiences that they have had historically that define who they are as people? And then I think the last thing that the last trend I'll name, there are many more, but there's also trends of data, impact, digital, those kinds of trends that are coming up. Because of the pressures companies are facing, they want some quick fixes. They like, give us the digital fix. They want in data. And the big challenge around that is, does digital help us with our humanity? And the big challenge around that is, what are we measuring when we say we want impact? So I think there's amazing trends happening. People are asking the right questions. South Africa has done amazing work in terms of financial inclusion, in terms of looking at gender-based violence. So we also have a ways to go.
Perfect. And Ricky, I think I love what you said there. I think it's almost belonging is how we be with each other. And we don't often recognize enough of the being, right? It's all about, like you said, we're doing stuff, but the doing might not actually be achieving the goals we actually intended and might actually like flip us onto unintended consequences. And that gets probably even worse when we look at things like generative AI and biases being programmed in, and all of a sudden we've got another layer of complexity, right, that we're actually dealing with without addressing some of those real people-centered issues. So I think the challenge for all of us, right, we're living through this, we are working together, we're working with people, and we do have biases. I think we all recognize that. But what advice or what could we do to help better equip people, leaders and individuals? What can we do to, I think, take more practical steps to either educate ourselves or be more aware of some of the things that people may be going through. And Melissa, I'm going to come to you because Ricky looks a bit frozen on my screen at the moment, and I'm hoping she will be back with us shortly. But perhaps I know you've got some real lived experience around this. And what have you seen? Perhaps what do leaders need to recognize, and what, as individuals, what difference can we make, perhaps by sometimes highlighting behavior that doesn't fit with the sense of belonging?
Absolutely, and leaders play such a critical role in setting the tone around culture. But I will say I do take I use leadership in a, I suppose, it, everyone can be a leader. I know it
Yeah.
sounds really cliched, but we do need to step in and step up for each other when
Mm,
we find ourselves in situations where actually this doesn't feel right, or there's we're not promoting open dialogue. We're not ensuring that there's equal opportunities. So we all have a role to play in that.
mm,
From a cultural point of view, I do think your senior leadership team, your boards, they do play a role in setting the tone, but between each other, this is where we need to set those rules around what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
mm,
So it's all about everyone being accountable and upholding the values of equity, inclusion, and belonging. But that those values need to be defined at a senior level, and then reinforced through practice, through demonstrating respect for
mm,
individuals, promoting a culture of inclusion, and integrating it into strategic goals. So while I absolutely agree wholeheartedly, the human-centric approach, and it's how we behave with each other. There is a reality around what gets measured gets done. So culture is a really interesting thing. Shaping culture is really interesting because people, our default setting is going to be towards our bias. And our
mm,
bias is telling us that we are right in this instance, because it doesn't mean to say that what we're thinking needs to be validated or factual, but our beliefs and our experiences reinforce our decision making. And it can play out in various ways in the organization: access to opportunities,
mm,
who we employ, who we listen to, how circle of influence is, and how homogenous or how diverse that circle of influence is. So challenging those biases it's extremely important. Um, but we also need, so that the behavioral side also needs to be reinforced by measurement, by policies, by procedures, by
mm,
practices that actually allow for equity to happen. Um, so implementing equity in the workplace, it's all about fair treatment. It's all about access to opportunity, advancement for all employees, and it's about eliminating those barriers. And it's behavioral, but it's also
mm,
systemic, and you have to measure to see success. Um, Otherwise, DE&I, it becomes this really vague, fluffy thing. And when someone
mm,
sees something quite tangible around data with the data, and this is a trend that I am so passionate about, looking at the numbers, but not just looking at the numbers and saying, okay, we got 2 males, 3 females here, 5 ethnic minorities. It's bringing those insights to the business. It's taking those insights
mm,
and saying, hey, we've got this picture. We can infer from all the data points that we have that this is the experience of people, and this is what we would like to see as an organization. And hey, we're also validating it because we're listening to our people. This is what they're
mm,
saying. This is their lived experience.
mm,
Lived experience should not be, it can't be understated, to actually listen to someone and understand the impact of systems and practices and the culture of
mm.
the organization.
And I think, Melissa, that is so important. And I guess the challenge is sometimes it's as you mentioned, there is this opportunity for conflict, but it's also perhaps challenging some of the thinking of existing leaders who may have a different lived experience and now have to think differently about it. So maybe, Ricky, to ask you the same question, but perhaps in a different way, is what can we do as individuals? What can we do as leaders, whether it's in society, in our organizations? And what have you perhaps seen leaders do effectively through facilitation and training that can actually help them maybe understand what steps they need to take to address this, or what do we need to be aware of to get this working better? And what have you seen that might help people on the call today?
So, Kerry, before I dive into your question, I think I want to talk a little bit about how we integrate and operationalize
Mm,
diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. Because I think that as long as we siphon it off as an HR prerogative or an HR type KPI, as long as we're looking at it and focusing only impact of people and not seeing that it really impacts in a strategic and bottom line sense, then the kind of integration across the operations is where you will get the barriers. So interestingly, I was working with a mining company last year. Everybody at leadership level understood why they need to get women in mining. But the thing that they said is our people don't understand and the systems don't help. Men don't want women on the face front of the mind because women get pregnant, that affects our team. Our team doesn't deliver the KPIs our team has because the KPIs on our team are about delivery. They're not about do we get along. They're not about do we belong,
mm,
right? And so we can't get our men to work in effective ways. It shows up in violence. It shows up in all sorts of negative impacts on women employees. Right. So when you listen to that story, what you see is that how we do our operations must change. Diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging is about transforming the very nature of business, the how
mm,
we do business, not the how we bring people in.
mm,
And that is what leaders need to begin to understand. That transformation is a transformation of everyone and everything about business. Now, the business leaders that we've worked with who have been most effective in driving change are the ones who take the time to understand and internalize that for themselves. That means they get
mm,
to grips with unconscious bias. They get to grips with their history. They're the experts in their sector, in the work that they do, but they often do not have the space and the support to get to grips with the fast changing world. And the fact that how I learned to do business when I was doing my MBA is not how business is today. And if I want to be effective, I have to be a different kind of leader. I have to respond to all sorts of pressures. I have to show up for my teams in particular ways. And I have to set up now business organizational systems that enable and support all of it. And so where we have seen the most effect is where business leaders take the time to do that. They integrate the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion into their
mm,
strategy work and into their own their leadership work and their transformation work. When the top business is committed and they show up on day one of the training, when the top business speak to everyone with confidence from the beginning and say, we're taking this new direction and we're going to support you to take this new direction. When top business leaders do that, and then they take it down into their organizations, you tend to have people show up. So they have to be responsive. They, people don't want to go to the first thing people ask me at training is, well, did my manager do that? Because I hear what you're saying, but my manager doesn't manage that way.
Exactly.
So
mm.
right? So we have to go into the organization through the actual practice of leadership. And as soon as people can see leadership is responsive, they show up for the hard changes they have to do themselves.
Mm. I do want to just add,
Mm,
I think that's a really fantastic point, Ricky. Um, leaders are in a very tenuous position. They are being measured for commercial output. They're being measured for margins, and that is and that is almost contradictory to what we're trying to achieve in terms of integration and inclusion and belonging and that sense of connectedness. Um, so that measurement, that kind of incentive needs to change. How leaders are measured to actually get it done, because not all leaders are going to drink the Kool-Aid. They're not going to go, yay, I'm going to be a DE&I cheerleader. There's going to be there's going to be the D&I cheerleaders like us that are going to promote. There's going to be the detractors that are going to be like, show me the money. And then there's going to be the middle. That's actually where we need to actually think about how do we help equip those people to actually make the right decisions in their day-to-day. How do we make sure that they've got the tools at their disposal to actually create a culture of equity and inclusion and lead with that in the front of mind. If this was easy, I mean, I've been trying to work myself out of a job for a very long time. Ask Kerry. If this was easy, we would have done it already.
Yeah.
Behavioral change is really, really challenging. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, Ricky.
Yeah. And I think, Ricky, you made a very interesting point there, and it's very much linked to the drive, I think, for even organizations to embrace sustainability and non-financial indicators. And that is this integration point, right? Because you can do it where it is just one lot of people focusing on trying to get some numbers right, because that's what we think as a business we need to do. But unless it is truly integrated into measurement of performance, if a leader's KPIs include some measurement of the impact on DE&I and society, it would be different. And Melissa, 100%, right? Businesses are still, unfortunately, commercial, major focused animals. And if you start interfering with how they're going to achieve that, they are very sensitive, probably to, and probably perhaps a little bit more sort of not drinking the Kool-Aid, to put it in your words, of making that change. But I think, Ricky, your point is 100% valid. It's that integration. How do we get it integrated? It's not just a side, silo of here's another thing we need to report on or do. And how do we actually integrate this in a way that's going to harness the potential and help us actually build a business that is resilient for the future? And that does, embrace different people, because our customer base probably looks very much the same. And how do we get the right stuff actually flowing? So maybe there's some really good questions in the chat, so I do want to get to those, but maybe more personal reflection for each of you. So what lessons, perhaps, and Ricky, I'll start with you this time, is what lessons have you reflected on as you operate in this space, in South Africa? And what have you perhaps learned through the work you do? And it's made you kind of stop and think about, oh, that's interesting. Or, this is a aha moment that I've helped someone actually experience.
What was I going to say? I wanted to say that when we talk about integration, it really helps us to recognize that there is a false boundary between business and society, right? And so integration is not just inside of a business, but it's also into society. It doesn't help to say you have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and then your product line offends particular sectors of community or offends the clients you're trying to reach. So integration is big. It's about going into the very fabric of every element of the business, down to how do we market, who are our customers, what are our products, and how are our products responding to the needs of our customers, in fact, marginalized customers who have historically not been able to access our product. And that is why, for me, GIB is so critical for business because it has transformative potential for society. I was reading earlier this year that I think up to 75% of our global GDP is in business. The people that own that money are business. And then we say we want to change our world, right? It doesn't sit in government, it's in business. So, like, if we can get it right in business, we can really get it right in society. So, I think one of the big aha moments for me has been this, like, the link between business and sustainable development in a global sense, SDGs in a global sense. And the SDG assessment from last year, we're saying actually we need to be looking at that link more closely. Now, if we talk about GIB, how does that make sense for sustainable development? And businesses, I'm not sure they understand that sustainable development is the foundation of their very existence. Because with no circular economy, there's no income, there's no one to buy your stuff. You can be as nice as you like, but no one's going to be there to buy your product. And so it's about really beginning to understand that these two areas we've held apart for so long are one and the same. And how do we use our different skills and resources in these two areas in order to take everyone in society forward? The second big aha goes back to our discussions about, like, who drinks the Kool-Aid, right? And the big aha moment for me was me asking myself, so actually, what are business leaders for, right? And that's where you begin to see the multi-stakeholder element of it, because business leaders are taught in business school. And so we can't say, oh, they won't drink the Kool-Aid. We need to be asking, how do we define this leadership? And where are they taught what leadership is and why? Because I've been doing DIB work for 10 years now. And I'm like, we're still in the same place, guys. Meaning that the new people who've gone through MBA 10 years later still don't have it integrated in their own learning, that this is critical. And that really helps us to begin to see that it is deep work, it is hard work, it takes a lot of time, but it can't just be done by business. It's multi-stakeholder. So some of the drivers for sustainability that came out of the scientific analysis from last year was that we have to get better at multi-stakeholder, working with different stakeholders. Was that we have to recognize the people of practitioners, the role of practitioners like myself, that we don't know how to hold those spaces where we work together. We don't know how to hold those spaces where we challenge ourselves and we begin to think in different ways. But there are people who know how to do that, and we have to give them room to do that. And then also we kind of, I think, have to slow down. A lot of, when I go into businesses, people are like, okay, do the training, you've got 3 months, and then they expect everything to turn around. But it doesn't work like that. People need time to think about it. People need time to be angry about it, to grieve. And then they come to the point where they're like, but that makes sense because I also would like to be treated that in my organization. And we often don't give ourselves time for that, which is why we're just running the treadmill on the same training issues, as opposed to investing in a more long-term process. And with that long-term process and the right kind of support, because people will now start to ask different things. We have one client where people were like, okay, we worked with them for over a year. After a year, the people come back to us and they say, we heard you on this inclusion thing. You're right. We need to be more inclusive of LGBTQI. But here's my problem. I'm Muslim and I don't know how to work with that. Where do I get help working with? So that's how the process happens. That's why you have to be human-centric. So here they are, they're showing up, they're like, I'm ready to do this, but they don't have the resources for the doing of it. And we need to be able to be thinking in those ways. Where do we start? How do we move step by step incrementally so that in 10 years' time, I'm not asking, what do leaders learn in MBA? I'm saying, no, wow, we can see that people know how to change and people have gained confidence in change.
Mm. And Ricky, I love that. And it's like it's going on a bit of a journey, right? And recognizing that it's not going to be done in step one. And we can't just tick the box and say we did the training and therefore everyone is now good. And that I think is part of the mindset shift that does need to happen. This is a journey. And to change, as Melissa, as you were saying, behavior and culture is not an overnight thing. And it's going to be a complex and perhaps not such a pretty or pain-free process as we do it. But when we come out the other side, we'll hopefully be stronger and have resilience and have people far more committed and involved to actually what they're working on and with and who they work with. But maybe, Melissa, if I can ask you the same question, like what lessons does it reflect for you? What aha moments have you come across? And then we'll take some questions from the chat.
So, I mean, there's a plethora of aha moments. Like DE&I, it requires continuous effort, continuous learning, continuous adaptation. We have to be able to be open to that, even as specialists and strategists. We're not fully formed. We don't know everyone's lived experience. So it's tapping into those groups and being open to it. Also, what's really important when it comes to leadership and to any kind of introduction of characteristics or focus in on characteristics or intersectionality, we are challenging the distribution of power. We are challenging how people see themselves in the hierarchy of society, in the hierarchy of an organization. Who are the insiders and who are the outsiders? And that tends to play out repetitively and it's of course reinforced by behaviors, by bias, and that drives our behaviors. People aren't making those links between those things. They are mostly having a fear reaction. So, when I talk about drinking the Kool-Aid and not drinking the Kool-Aid, in society, we have those groups that are for, against, and in the middle. And as a DE&I lead, there's different ways, strategic ways of actually within an organization trying to create a groundswell. So it's identifying that those allies, those advocates, and keeping them loud and active. But working with that middle group to say, okay, this is the why of it all. This is the why of it all, and how this is going to improve outcomes, and working really closely with them. So, and then with the detractors, which you'll have in any group. We see it in politics all the time. It has to be evidence-based for them to actually want to be on the journey. So they're going to want to look to that middle group and the other group around, okay, this is the way we're doing things now. So those are the things where I've learned about how to manage those groups of people in a strategic way to really help drive change within an organization. We need that whole group. The detractors are important as well because they challenge our thinking too. We have to be able to talk to detractors. Yeah. We have to be able to say, this is why we're thinking this way, and also be receptive to what their concerns are. Because if the concern is there, the concern is valid. And if we can't answer it, we need to ask ourselves why we can't answer it as DE&I leads. So the lesson there is not to go with a one size fits all for everyone, to actually meet people where they're at. And that's not always going to be, the challenging part is the ones that don't drink the Kool-Aid. That's the ones that actually are energy vampires and they take a lot from us because we can't really think. How can you not want inclusion? How can you want to do this way when you know this is the right way? But it sharpens our tools when we're able to actually deal with those situations. I've also learned that to celebrate the wins. It's really hard because you want a watershed moment, equality for all genders, women being represented adequately, Black women being represented adequately, ethnic minorities having the right equitable supports in place. You want to have those watershed moments. But it's not, it's so incremental. So it's back to that piece around it is a journey. It's a marathon. It's more than a journey, it's a marathon. So we have to sustain our energy and take the wins where we can take the wins. And know that we're doing work that doesn't just affect a organization, but has a massive ripple effect into society and create societal value and societal impact. The role of DE&I is much larger than the organizations that we serve. So when we walk away at the end of the day, we put down our tools and we feel the fatigue of the work that we do, the emotional fatigue. It's because we're doing work that's really impacting people. It's that human-centric approach. So those are some of the lessons that's top of mind at the moment. There's plenty more, but I'd love to get to the questions.
I think we'll have to get yourself and Ricky to partner up and do a book for us, or a follow-on where we can dig some more, to go into some more depth on this. Ricky, anything from your side before we tackle some questions?
I just wanted to again come back on those who won't drink the Kool-Aid. The thing is, ultimately, that costs a company more. So when I go into companies, I'm like, and I understand, these can often be our best business leaders. These can be our golden child, the one who's bringing the biggest money. But it's in the end cost the company. So when we look at data, we look at data that is important, we then begin to say who are we using and where we use them in order to be able to link to the quality of leadership. What is our retention? We look at what is the advancement in progress. We look at that kind of data, and we're able to say something about your leadership, despite your wonderful numbers, is a problem. But ultimately, it's costing business in terms of brand value, and it's now financially costing business. I saw yesterday that Netcare had to pay a huge fine. They had to pay a huge amount to an employee who they had not protected from a toxic golden child. They knew he brought the money. They also knew he was toxic, and they didn't do anything about it. So now we're living in a world where we are understanding mental health as important, well-being as important, and people are taking those cases up. So we have to recognize this thing between society and business is, if business is not going to be responsive and supportive of the transformation we're doing in society, they're also going to suffer the back end. And there are lots of cases of that in South Africa. We've got the boycott of Click because they went and did a campaign that was insulting to Black women. And then that was a huge brand failure. So they are real data cases. So if you don't get it right within yourself as a leader, you're actually too expensive to keep in our business. And I think businesses must become realistic about that.
Yeah. And Ricky, I would agree with you. I think the lack of connecting these impacts to the financial outcomes in the business is a problem. And until we can do that effectively and say, absolutely, this person, for example, is great, but this is the consequence of these actions. So actually, you said they did this, but actually, their personal set of financial statements that they've delivered to the business is actually negative. And that might change behavior, because then it's in a business framed discussion that is understandable because it's the commercial model that kind of like is the measurement tool. And I guess that will be a very interesting way to look at it, and maybe a challenge to us that come from finance and accounting backgrounds to think about how we do that.
Absolutely. And then reinforcing that with the supports that that person actually needs to be a
Yeah.
better leader. Because there's no point
Yeah.
in giving them the stick if you're not going to
No.
give them the tools. So
Mm.
working with those detractors, working with the people that aren't necessarily seeing the cost to the company, to help them be better leaders, to show them what success looks like. That's really
Yeah.
important. It's not about discounting them. It's about actually helping them be better leaders. Are some people beyond repair? Yeah, they will be. But on balance, people will do the right thing when they are incentivized in the right way, and we can provide them with the supports they need to accelerate as inclusive leaders.
Perfect. So let's get some questions. So there's a question in the chat. To what extent do we disadvantage people further, perhaps, by focusing more on getting the numbers right than actually creating environments that foster real respect, real maturity, and proper people skills to basically treat all people right? So perhaps that's a good question to start with. So, I mean, I think you've both touched on it slightly, but perhaps if you'd like to perhaps comment and respond to that, Melissa, perhaps I'll let you take the
Sure.
lead on that one, and then Ricky can add to it.
Absolutely. So I do think that there is a space for numbers because you have to identify the issue in a qualitative and in a quantitative way to speak that business language. So the disadvantaging people further, I think that's the intentionality of the business that you're working in. What they see the data driving. So to what extent do we disadvantage a group further by focusing on getting the numbers right? I think that I don't think that we disadvantage. It's about the intention of how we use those numbers to effect change. The data is only one step in the journey. The other part is the lived experience, and then what remedies, what equitable interventions are we putting in place, and that then talks to getting the environment right, looking at the systemic issues, what processes are actually disadvantaging people. But it's an ecosystem. All of these things need to work together.
Cool. And Ricky, anything from your side to add to that answer?
I think we have to disadvantage people depending on what we mean getting the numbers. So when we say getting the numbers right, if we're talking about representation, if we're talking about Black economic empowerment, is what it's called in South Africa, affirmative action is what it's called in other countries. If we're talking about that being the sole and primary focus of the work that we do in the name of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and belonging, we disadvantage people. And when I've worked in South African companies, global companies, what you see is we get the numbers right at entry level, but we don't have advancement, we don't have opportunity. We literally take people into the workplace in order to show them why they marginality that they are not valued. I mean, I was working with a global firm last year, and it was astonishing to establish that yes, they're getting the numbers right, but in terms of an advancement and opportunity, young Black employees are sitting on the back bench. No one supports them, no one mentors them, and then they are unable to advance. They can't show the data that I've achieved this and this and this. So, yes, the system is integrated. Yes, where we focus is so important. But if we're talking the numbers, and all we consider the numbers to be is do we have the right representation, then yeah, we're disadvantaging those who are tokenizing to reach our numbers.
And I think that is a risk, right? If it's that thing of, and Melissa, to your point as well, it's again an integration thing. It's not, oh, well, we just need to get the numbers right. It helps us to perhaps look at, where are we falling short? But if it's just a case of let's put the people and the numbers in the right places, and we don't think about the other impacts around that and equipping people and having a path for progression to get those numbers different at different levels, we actually just are like ticking the box, I guess, right? And not really serious about actually making this a business or strategic imperative. So maybe leading on from that is another question, which says organizational readiness and commitment beyond beautiful DEIB statements in organizational visions. Just how do we actually get organizations and leaders to truly embrace this agenda and not make it a tick box exercise, but truly transformational? How we actually operate our business. Have you seen an example would be helpful? So perhaps to ask, have you seen where perhaps it is being treated as transformational and what's happened? Or do you have an example that you could share where it was more transformational than just, we'll just tick the boxes and make sure we've got it? So maybe, Ricky, I can start with you.
Thanks, Kerry. So we do have an example that we're very proud of. The organization I mentioned that we had worked with for over a year. And here are some of the things that needed to happen. Number one, the leadership made a commitment themselves as leadership around inclusive justice. Yeah, they wanted to see inclusive justice a reality. They broke down the barriers between what happens in society and what happens in business. They had already done it when they came to us for support. Number two, they were looking for a program that was catalytic. So it's going to have like a significant impact for its people. It is going to talk to how we define leadership in our organization. It is going to talk to what systems we put in place. So with this particular organization, we were looking at everything through the lens of gender-based violence, because that really allowed us to work with people in a way that they could see that what happens at work does have a lot to do with what happens in society. It allowed us to hold safe spaces for people to really examine what have we been taught, what are our norms, and how are we showing up at that in the workplace. And the things that worked so well about this leadership process is because from a leadership perspective, as I said, they had already made certain commitments and they were looking for a partner that was going to help them to interpret those commitments. So that deep personal commitment up front is what's most important. One of the things that I really is so difficult for us as a practitioner is I'm trying to convince you as a leader that you need to be doing the work that you need to be doing, right? Rather than, okay, we've decided that we've agreed. The second was recognizing that it was a real investment, right? So not a quick, how can you get it done in as little time, as this little resource, which is something that we also hear a lot of practitioners. Yeah, we know we need to get that, we need to tick that box, but can it actually only be 1 hour? Can you get it all done in just 1 hour? Can you please reduce the budget? So there was a deep commitment on the door, and that commitment was operational. For them, they knew that a time is a resource. So it was a context that is how would you call it? Like a logistics context. So people have to be working and all the time. That's part of the job. So because they committed to the process, they also committed to people taking the time. And so they found a way to juggle their own schedule to ensure that people had time to go through this process. And it was a long process. I say about a year, we met with people 3 to 4 hours at a time, some days a whole day at a time. So you can imagine you're taking 5 teams off your logistics floor for a whole day. But they recognize that's what it takes. That's what it took for me as a leader to commit. That's what it takes for my people to commit. And they allocated the time, they allocated the resources to make that. When we started, people didn't have digital access. So there's an assumption around digital access, and then they realize, oh, we actually don't have bandwidth, and people can't easily access internet. So that led to the provision of digital access on the side. So all of that, very responsive leadership. Our first feedback led them to realize that our aspirations for leadership is not being met by the actions and practice of our leadership. So then along with that, they took a program that was about building their leadership at senior management level. And they already now were integrating the lessons around what it is to be an inclusive leader. So it's that kind of partnership, back and forthing, that realizing that, okay, here's the problem, so here's how we can fix it. And the willingness to commit the resources to it. The outcome was within a year, actually, there was a culture shift. And it showed up in all sorts of ways. The way that people spoke up and were confident about themselves when they work in a context, it showed up in all sorts of ways. The way that people are confident now to talk about gender-based violence and to bring their processes and the issues to the organization, the way the organization had now built a seamless system of responding on gender-based violence. So before they knew they had a problem, but they had zero data. When we were finished, they had 600% data, 600% increase in the problem, but also all that 600% had been resolved. They had built the system. So it is about, we as leaders know we have to do this. We know that the commitment is not a pledge. It's a resource commitment. We might have to take a bite before we see the results. But we also know that we have to respond all the time. It's a partnership with the people who are helping us. So that's what we do as practitioners. We help, we support. But you're the organization that has to take a decision that, okay, so we realize we have a problem here. We solve that, and you continue in that journey together of co-creating and supporting. And that's the way you eventually see changes in the end. And by the way, that organization then had great financial returns at the end of the month.
Thank you, Ricky. That's an awesome example. But Melissa, I'd like you to, if you can, touch on, I know a program that's very close to your heart is something you've done around refugees and access to employment.
Absolutely.
And that might be another really good example to share in terms of a program where using DEIB as a visionary sort of strategic initiative can actually create change.
Absolutely. I will probably pair it with one of the questions around challenging ageism against women in the workplace. And the reason I'm going to tie it to that question is this was probably the genesis of my career in diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I came to Ireland, I worked for an asset manager, and then I moved to Standard Life, and I started a return to work program specifically for people aged 45 to 60 years old. And that was as a result of actually looking at the data around employment data and marginalized groups. So in my work, I really like, I of course want to look at all various characteristics, how they interact with society, with how they interact with systemic practice and behaviors and values. But I also want to address the most marginalized groups, the outsiders that are overlooked, but can have the potential to have a real impact within society should they be included. So how can we use D&I to challenge ageism? I think things like a real focus around those employability programs, and so I'm looking at that question through that lens, and helping people actually access opportunities, break down those barriers, and show organizations how people from marginalized communities or overlooked communities can actually contribute significantly to an organization through their diverse perspectives. That is a long story to get me to EY and the Refugee Access Program, which is something that I'm particularly proud of in Ireland, and I'm sure you've seen it across the globe. There's been massive migration from various countries for various reasons, be it war, be it asylum seeking on an individual level, be it due to environmental impact. People have been moving and navigating their way across Europe. We've had a significant influx of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers over the time that I've lived here. It's increased significantly over the last 2-3 years. A lot of it due to the Ukraine war. But the Refugee Access Program is really about tapping into those individuals that are seen as a specific archetype. So I want everyone on the call to actually think about what a refugee looks like, what you believe a refugee, their education level is, what you believe their how they could contribute to society, what roles should they have within society, and just hold that for a second. Refugee Access Program is about bashing all those stereotypes. We've had people come through the program. It's going on to its 4th year now, who have come with significant experience and through the program rebuilt their confidence and also capabilities. So they may have been out of work for the 3, 4, 5, 6 years, haven't seen Excel spreadsheets, haven't seen in a while, and we give them the tools to actually get those soft skills, but also additional qualifications as well, so that they have the confidence to go into the open market and also potentially join EY. So the whole point of it is so they can build that confidence to gain access to the employment market, so they can contribute to society and be less marginalized. Unfortunately, it is an uphill battle because we've got systems in place in Ireland that hold refugees in a specific situation for quite a long time, our direct provision system. But I've seen the transformative nature of the Refugee Access Program. I've seen the transformative nature
Hello.
of, hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen the transformative nature of the access program, not just from an access to employment, but from how the individual has just flourished because we have such a human-centric approach. I will put a link into the Refugee Access Program in the chat, but it's equity programs like that's actually at the heart, or that's born out of the core of an organization, and driven by, I mean, each program takes about 100 volunteers, has over 50 workshops on it over a 12-week period. And it's really born out of this human-centric approach. And I dare I say, it's, for me, I feel the fingerprints of Ubuntu all over it. It's woven into it. So I'm particularly proud of that. And these are the things, it doesn't take a lot of money. Actually, it's one of the most affordable things that we do in EY, to be honest. And it has such a transformative impact. So we've had people go on to work in EY, they've gone on to further education, they've gone on to getting jobs in other businesses like Bank of Ireland, like within pharmaceuticals. They've just absolutely flourished. So these are things that we can do, and it's in our power to do. I've also seen other organizations do amazing things, like reverse mentorship programs, to actually get the lived experience of an individual. And the organization I'm thinking of is Medtronic. They're in Galway, and it was a white Irish ally that started this program because he saw the data. Because he saw the data of people who have double majors in their organization not progressing through the organization. And he asked himself why. So he started working with people from the Black community in Medtronic, and they started a reverse mentorship program, and they've seen amazing results of people progressing into the levels that they should be in within that organization. Again, cost effective, impactful, but you need that commitment. You need that commitment from the organization, and it shouldn't just be driven by DE&I.
Yeah.
I think that message has come across loud and clear today, right? And it is that thing of, I always feel if we make it the role of a department to solve the problem, it's very easy for it to be blamed on, well, those people didn't actually do it. Whereas this is something very much, I think, like sustainability, it needs to be integrated across the organization. We as leaders, as individuals, need to go, okay, so maybe this is something that makes me uncomfortable, and I need to think about why it makes me uncomfortable and address that for myself. And what resources can I use then to say, I'm not comfortable with this, or it's causing me, conflict, or how do I deal with it? And how do I internalize? And what can I learn by perhaps getting a different perspective on it? So Melissa and Ricky, I think we could carry on for another 2 hours and we would be like good. But I just want to say from my side, it has been absolutely wonderful to have you with us. Melissa, thanks. I see you've got the African earrings on and like the colorful dress just to remind us where you come from. And Ricky,
This
always
is all from South Africa, just by the way. I'm just saying. This is in my last trip. The dresses from South Africa, it's, handmade in South Africa, the earrings and the beads. Yeah, I love my Africanness. I might be Afro-Irish, but I'm still Afro.
And Ricky, just thank you for your insights and sharing your wisdom, because the work you do in this space is so meaningful. And it's been great to have you share some of that really practical stuff around how we can actually do this and do it right. And I think, with the world changing and the dynamics at the moment and DEI being dragged into the spotlight, perhaps for the wrong reasons, it's refreshing to sit down and have a conversation why we should do it and what are the right reasons. So, ladies, I can just say thank you from my side. It's been wonderful to host you. And thank you to everyone who stuck with us and listened in. I know we've run over perhaps the time we had planned for, but I think we couldn't stop the conversation. It's been wonderful. So thank you. Have a wonderful Friday, everyone, and enjoy the weekend. And I wish you a blessed day further. And I hope that we can all learn something from the time we've shared together this morning.